Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. We're on a new time today. It's a special time, and that's because we have somebody from the West joining us today. We didn't want her to get up with the chickens and the roosters, so she's joining us today, which is 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you for joining us. If you're joining us live, you can put your questions or comments in the comment section, and we will address those live on air. If you're watching a replay, you can also put questions and comments, and those will be commented on by other people who are watching replays. But our guest, Katie, will not be available forever to address questions and comments in the comment section. But if you're watching live today, Thursday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, she most definitely will be available to you. Good morning, Katie. Thank you for joining us this morning.
It's my pleasure. I'm really glad to be here with you.
Oh, we appreciate it. I want to tell our audience, we are discussing emotional boundaries today. Now, what are emotional boundaries? Why is it a good idea to have them with our teens and tweens? That's what Katie is going to tell us about. She is a clinical social worker. I'm going to hold my notes here to make sure I get it right. She's a clinical social worker specializing in parenting, and she's also an author. She's going to tell us more about that. She helps parents see the key connections that help resolve family difficulties, strengthen the parent-child relationship, and get families back on balance and moving forward together. And part of that process is having emotional boundaries. That's what we're going to talk about. Before we get to that, tell us a little bit about yourself, your work, and your book, How to Talk to Your Teen About Anything, which I loved. It's full of real life scenarios, quizzes, and all kinds of helpful information. So we thank you for that.
Thank you. I'm proud of myself because I remembered to grab it before I sat down. So easy to forget things that are important, but there's my book, How to Talk to Your Teen About Anything. One of the things I like about it is it's pretty. It has color.
Nice.
Also, I like the content, but let's see. So I'm a therapist. I'm in private practice. And like you said, I specialize in working with parents on parenting. I got into this because I was a play therapist and a family therapist first, had done that for a long time. And then I became a parent. And when I became a parent, I was like, oh my God, this is such a hard job. Where's the help for me? And so I realized that so much of what's hard in parenting or with our kids is something that parents can and want to do something about. And it's my pleasure to work with parents to give them information, insight, and tools that help them address behaviors that are hard. So that's really what I do all day long, and I love it. I work one-on-one and I teach classes.
Oh, tell us a little bit about the classes. I know you have one coming up, right?
I do. I have a couple that are starting in August and September. See, I should have looked that up. The first one is for parents of kids with ADHD, and it's really for all ages. So even if you've got a younger kid all the way up through teens, very appropriate for you. It's a 4-class series, and we'll talk about things like understanding the diagnosis, having a new perspective on it, and the difference between can't versus won't, which I think is kind of fun, especially with teenagers. And then the second class is just for parents of teens, and it's called Teenage Moods and Mental Health. And it's kind of a crash course in everything that I think a parent would find useful in understanding mental health as a service, how to access it, what you need to know when a parent should worry, when you should reach out for professional help, stuff like that. So I'd love for your viewers to join me.
We've already put up the link for your book, your website, and now we're putting up the links for the classes. As people who watch us regularly know, the amazing Jessica is behind the scenes, and she takes care of all of that for us. So if you're interested in those, the links are in the comment section. Now let's get to our topic. What are emotional boundaries?
So, let's start there. So I would define an emotional boundary as a psychological delineation between two people. So an emotional boundary, the boundary, is where my emotions stop and yours start.
Okay.
So it's that thing that allows us to have a separation in our emotional lives. And like you said, they're very helpful with parenting. They're also helpful everywhere, at work, marriage, you name it.
Okay, so I need you to further explain, because you say it's a psychological delineation between emotional experiences of two people. The boundary is when one person's feelings stop and another's start. So explain that to us. If my emotions stop here and yours start, what is that space? What
You
is
got it.
happening?
Right. So I care about you. Like, let's talk about it as if I'm talking about my teenager. When my teenager is really upset about something, she had a bad day at work, or her friend is driving her crazy, something like that. Sometimes our teenagers come to us with big emotions, and I care very much. And so I'm going to feel some sort of parallel emotion, but our emotions are not hooked to the same roller coaster. I can still have my emotions, different emotions, smaller emotions, even though she is having bigger ones or upset ones. And so that boundary, it's a line, and you just draw it with your mind. Although sometimes I use my whole body to do it, but it's a place where I say to myself, I can let her emotions be hers, and I don't have to take ownership of them. I don't have to escalate with her. I can let our emotional experiences move separately, even though she's my teenager and I love her.
No, and I understand that, because it can happen in different ways. It can happen with your interaction if you guys are having a conflict, but it can also happen when your teenager comes home and they're talking about maybe a conflict with another teenager, and you don't necessarily need to share the emotion that they're having, or as some like to call, be overly involved in in it with them emotionally.
Yeah, exactly.
So, okay. I want to remind people that what we're talking about now is merely one chapter in your book. So I want people to know that when you're listening to our conversation, you're not getting the whole book. So you still want to get the book, but it is an important chapter, and that's why we're talking about this one chapter. But why are these emotional boundaries important, especially in a parent-child relationship?
Because we love our kids so much that their emotions and ours and our energy and everything else is like mixed together so easily. And it's love, right? So like when you have a baby, you are responsible for their emotions, their regulation, their calming, right? They're hungry, they start to cry. It is your job to go and pick them up and love on them and help them calm down. But every day, every month that our kids get a little bit older, we have to let them become separate people. We have to let their inner emotional lives and responsibility for their emotional regulation shift more and more and more and more onto their plate. And so emotional boundaries, when we don't have them balanced in the way that is right for us, it means sometimes that parents are over involved, like you said. It means sometimes the parents feel worried about the kids' emotional challenges, so much so that the parent will try to control the kid to prevent the problem. I don't want you to have that bad experience at school, and so I'm going to fight with you too much about whether you put deodorant on this morning or not, because the stinky 13-year-old is going to go to school and people are going to react to them for being stinky. And I don't want them to feel that shame and rejection from their peers. And so if my emotional boundaries aren't strong enough where I can let them have emotional experiences without it over impacting me, then I may cross the boundary and try to control them and sort of say, you absolutely have to take a shower and put on deodorant. And it's tied back with me feeling so worried about the emotional experience that they might have or are having.
I understand that. I think a lot of us do that. Because as you say in your book, we know what's going to happen down the road because we've been there before, or we've witnessed somebody else have the experience. And so often we want to help our children so that they don't have the negative experience.
It's true. Parents are usually much better at predicting situations and outcomes than teenagers are. And that doesn't always mean that we have to save them from those outcomes. But
are there different types or different levels of emotional boundaries?
Well, I think yes, absolutely. Some people have what I would call rigid emotional boundaries, meaning they're not very good at connecting or feeling or appreciating or even identifying someone else's emotions. And that's hard on a relationship. It's hard to be in a relationship with someone who doesn't see and value and respond to your emotions. It's especially hard when that person is your parent. And that's sort of on one end of a spectrum. And then on the other end of the spectrum are folks whose boundaries are pretty loose, a little too loose. And so that's actually kind of what I was describing earlier, a parent who's taking on their kids' emotions for themselves. They're over identifying, over connecting with their kids' emotions.
How can we manage emotional boundaries between our teens and ourselves, or our tweens?
Mm-hmm. I think a great place to start is with a big dose of self-awareness. So even knowing a little bit for yourself, like, how are you with emotional boundaries? Did your family growing up allow you to have your own feelings and to allow you to say, I want this, or I don't want this, I like this, I don't want this? Or did your family tell you what you liked and didn't like? You may have that awareness already of how you experienced emotional boundaries growing up and how easy or hard it is for you to hold them as an adult. So that's a great place to start, is just awareness.
Mm-hmm.
I think beyond that, there are things that we can do as parents to kind of catch ourselves in the moment when we're having a hard time. One of the tips that I give in the book, I call the velvet rope. And what I mean by that, you kind of have to picture it. So like if you can imagine yourself being in a movie theater, from like an old-fashioned movie theater, they always have these like brass posts with these velvet swags between them. Do you know what I'm talking about? And I think of that as a great visual metaphor for the type of emotional boundary you want to have with your teenager. So there are some people in our lives that we are going to build a brick wall that's 10 feet high. That's how much emotional boundary we want with those people, because they're not safe, because we don't want to have a good relationship with them, because they're bad for us, whatever. But that's not the kind of boundary you want with your teenager. You need to see and feel their emotions regularly, and they need to feel felt by you. So we need a visual metaphor that's much more porous than a 10-foot brick wall. And I love the velvet rope because it does clearly delineate, okay, my stuff is over here, your stuff is over there, but we're not the same, right? There is this space between us. And so sometimes starting with that awareness of how you are with boundaries in general, and then kind of having a like a mental trick that you can go back to and say, okay, velvet rope, velvet rope. My teenager is over there, they're having a hard time. I see them, but it's my job to stay on my side of the rope, and I can love on them, but I can still stay on my side of the rope. So sometimes having that as a metaphor is really helpful.
I love that, the velvet rope. If we stay on our side of the rope, because it's not always appropriate, as you say, for us to jump in. Sometimes they have to experience some things. You mentioned this in terms of age appropriate suffering, that we have to allow that. That's why one of the reasons we need these boundaries. Can you talk about that a bit?
Sure. It's kind of a weird phrase, isn't it? Age appropriate suffering. So where I'm coming from with that is that the truth is, many of the parents that I know and work with and love their kids so much that it hurts them a little bit to see their kids suffer. I mean, me too, right? It hurts me to see my kids suffer. And we as parents have to be able to let our kids suffer a little bit, because otherwise we're protecting them from some pretty important growth opportunities. Now, don't get me wrong, I am not advocating to make our kids suffer or to throw them into things that are dangerous or unhealthy, but that's where that phrase age appropriate suffering comes from. There are crummy experiences that are really common and normal for every age of life. So like the 13-year-old, and your friends make fun of you because you wore the wrong kind of shoes or whatever. Or a 16-year-old who wants to go to the party, but their parents won't let them, or wants to do something and it's out of the family budget. Many of these can be age appropriate suffering experiences. And I guess my point with it is the suffering has value. And what we as parents want is to find this sort of delicate middle space between making everything kind of soft and smooth and easy for our kids. We definitely want to do some of that, but not too much. And we don't want our kids on the other end of the spectrum. We don't want our kids suffering too much. We don't want them exposed to unhealthy or unsafe things. But this delicate space in the middle where they do have experiences that make them uncomfortable. They do have experiences that don't go the way they want, because the discomfort and the failure and all that stuff, those are really important human learning experiences. And so if my emotional boundaries are pretty well managed, then I can let my kid have age appropriate suffering without that triggering me to over identify and step in and rescue them. Or if my boundaries were too rigid, then I would leave too much suffering. Those parents need to pull back the other way.
Okay. Am I correct that if we allow for age appropriate suffering, then there will be building resilience?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because I mean, most adults that I know will tell you, oh yeah, that time I failed at XYZ is one of the places where I learned the most important lesson of my life. And how can we be resilient if we haven't failed, learned a lesson, tried again, been successful later? That's where resilience comes from, for sure. One of the places.
You mentioned that our view of emotional boundaries is based on how they were presented to us in our childhood.
It's a big influence.
So if we had a negative example in our childhood, whether there was trauma or whatever, or maybe we just had too rigid parents, how do we make a change for our present and our future with our families?
Oh yeah, love it. So I have two answers for that. One of them is, I am a therapist and I love therapy. I wish I could sprinkle it everywhere on everything, because I think therapy is such a useful tool for being able to understand yourself and figure out some of the messages you absorbed when you were a kid and whether or not they work for you anymore. And emotional boundaries is a great example of that, right? When we grow up in a family, we just sort of absorb the way things are done. And as adults, we have the opportunity to look back and say, is that actually are those lessons and self-images and things that I learned from childhood right for me anymore? And when they're not, we can use therapy as a way to explore and grow and change. So therapy. The other one is, I do sometimes see people who use their childhood experiences as sort of an opposite lesson, right? So they'll sometimes kind of run things through the, how would my parents have done this filter? And that gives them one data point, just one, that they can use to say, was it right for me as a child? Is this what I want to repeat for my kids? So like, if you happen to know that you had, your example, two very rigid parents, in any given parenting moment for yourself, you may look at it and say, okay, what would my parents do here? Okay, they would have come down hard or whatever. And then you might say, but I am trying to be less rigid than they were, so I need to be softer than I think they would have done. So it's like a little built-in data point in our memory banks.
Okay. You, in your book, as I mentioned, there are quizzes, there are real life scenarios. Can you give us an example of a situation where a parent has exhibited solid emotional boundaries? It is the right response in the situation.
Oh, I see so many. Let me think. Well, there is an example in the book that I could use. In the book, the story is between a mom and a daughter, and the daughter has her first name is Chinese, Xiaowei, and it's spelled with an X. And a lot of people, a lot of Americans, especially I think it's fair to say a lot of white Americans have a really hard time with the letter X and don't know how to pronounce it. And this was a true story that I got permission to share. This kiddo would go to school, and on the first day of school, the teachers would go through the attendance record and they would say, John Smith, you know, Susan Johnson. And then they would get to this kid's name and they would say, Mrs. Jones. And they wouldn't attempt to say her name. And it's an invalidation. It's like she wasn't ever recognized with her name. She wasn't seen properly. And it was really painful. And part of the kid's growth was figuring out how to advocate for herself in those situations. But part of the parents' big challenge was not like busting into those classrooms and giving lectures to these teachers about how important it was for them to learn how to say the kid's name. And I think the parents really wanted to do that. They really wanted to protect their kid from these crummy experiences, but the kid didn't want them to. And so an example of emotional boundaries, that example as an emotional boundaries done well, is the parent acknowledged that they felt very protective and a little mad and a little sad about what was happening to the kid. But they said, I'm going to handle my feelings myself without going in and trying to fix it in your life. And that was what that kid needed for a long time. And then I think at some point the kid figured out how to fix it for themselves. Uh-oh. I think we have a little lag.
Hi, I'm back.
Okay.
I don't know what happened. One of us went out. Okay, we're back. Yay. I like that example because I have traveled this life with the name Kamira. So that was a perfect example for me. And I understood that perspective. What do we do if we've set the appropriate emotional boundary and our teen or tween pushes back? They want something different. Is it about what they want, or is it about what's appropriate?
Well, it's both. I mean, and that's what's so tricky about parenting is it's always changing. So the older our kids get, the more of what they want matters. Because at some point they launch, they're on their own, they make all their own choices. What they want will be the guiding principle. But theoretically, they're not there yet if they're still living in our house. And so emotional boundaries are really helpful in that situation because can I, as a parent, tolerate it that my kid is mad at me, that my kid doesn't like the limit I've set, that they want me to do something different, right? Can I tolerate it if they think I'm the meanest, most strictest mom in the world? And that's an emotional boundary. Like, okay, can I handle it that you are dissatisfied with this? With my emotional boundary, I can feel on my inside that I'm making a healthy, reasonable choice that lines up with my values, et cetera, et cetera. And I can also acknowledge that you don't like it, but I can let you have those feelings while I have my feelings. And in the book, I have a little mantra for that, which it's, you may think that if you like. And so that is something you could say out loud to your teenager. I think it is mostly useful said inside your own head as a way to reinforce the boundary. That other person's thoughts, especially if it's your teenager, it's different if it's like your boss or something, because they do have some power and control over you, but your teenager's thoughts shouldn't necessarily hurt you. I care about them, but they don't hurt me. So I can say in my head, when she's mad at me because I said no or whatever, I can say, you can think that if you like. You can feel those feelings, you can think those thoughts.
I think that we talked about the mantra in the pregame, and I was going to bring it up after this question. I had them back to back for that reason. And I think it's a really important point to emphasize that our teens' thoughts shouldn't hurt us, because we have a lot of discussion about my teen is so mean to me, because a lot of what they're doing is age appropriate, so that we do have to have these emotional boundaries so that their thoughts don't hurt us. And
Yes,
so that we
yes.
can have our own version of, you may think that if you like, which I love. I wish I had that years ago. So thank you
And
for that too.
my pleasure. I'll tell you that I've said it again. I think its primary help is on the inside of your brain. But I have said it a handful of times to my kids out loud. And one of the things that inadvertently came about from me saying it to my teenagers is now every once in a while they say it to me. And the truth is that I love it. I may not love it in the moment because I'm always, I'm a little annoyed that they're setting an emotional boundary with me. But holy cow, they can set emotional boundaries. That means they get to launch into the world with such a gift, and it's thrilling. So,
Oh, I like that. I love that. At least you know they're listening. We we are at the end of our time together. But if there is one thing and one thing only that somebody remembers from this conversation, what should it be?
oh, I would love for people to think about how they feel around emotional boundaries. So close your eyes, think about a time recently when your kids' emotions impacted you, and see if you feel like you're holding your emotional boundaries in a way that's working for you.
Mhm.
And then just play around with it. See if the metaphor of the velvet rope helps you set a little bit more boundary for the folks who need to sort of lean in a bit and be a little bit more receptive. See if it helps with that. If you need the mantra of you may think that if you like, use that, but just do that piece of work on your own self and your own awareness to see
Mhm.
how are emotional boundaries for me, and do I want to tweak things in a particular direction, and would it feel good if I did?
Oh, yeah, I like that. So I think people at the end of our half hour have figured out that what we're talking about is really setting boundaries for ourselves so that we know how involved and how much independence to give our tweens and teens, and not necessarily setting hard, fast boundaries for them that they are not allowed to do this or they must do this. That because I think that that's what people assume when they hear boundaries. But
Yes.
that's not what we're talking about here.
No, it's something totally different. Yeah, kind of tricky, very different.
Thank you so much for this information. If you have your book, can you put it up again so that everyone can see it?
Of course, Mara, I'd be happy to.
There you go. How to talk to your teen about anything. What we just discussed is one chapter in the book. There are other chapters, there are quizzes, there are scenarios. It's really helpful and it is easy reading. So you don't have to feel like you need a degree in psychology to read it. It is parent friendly.
That was my goal for sure.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I want to remind you that you can join us again on Thursday for the Inside Scoop with Sue, when Sue will be talking. She's actually going to talk with someone whose title is a suicidologist, which I find fascinating. We have been doing a series on emotional health, depression, suicide, and that's one more in the series. So that will be Thursday, 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time on all of our platforms. The same one that you're on now, Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, or Twitter. Thanks a lot. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Kamara. It's been my pleasure.